The feedback that I got after the last session was that service users would like to get some information on anxiety and some what's described as tips and tricks. So I had to think about that, and obviously there's lots and lots of information about anxiety and the impact of anxiety available on a multitude of websites. But I've called this places we go to when things are uncertain or too much. And I wondered if it would be helpful to talk about specific emotions, because they mean what they mean to the person, and I accept that fully. But I wanted to start by offering my insight into different emotions, and by doing this I hope that some information would maybe help service users to recognise what's happening and understand it better, maybe label it and use strategies to regulate or respond. So this is based on what I've learned, not just as part of my own personal development, but also from clients, which means that everyone has their own experience, as I say, of these emotions. So it's not a one size fits all. As you see, I've kind of highlighted worried, stressed, overwhelmed, anxious, and panic. So if I start with worry, what I've learned about worry is it tends to be quite specific and focuses on thoughts in our head. Worry tends to create milder feelings of distress and can be felt as a proportionate response to a situation. So it might be about arriving somewhere on time and maybe the journey there, or perhaps, you know, getting everything done, sometimes a specific task that's got to be done on time, a specific task as opposed to multiple specific tasks. Those of us that have a tendency to worry sometimes have a belief that it can be helpful for coping, because if we're thinking about it all of the time, that means that kind of we're on top of it. Actually, it's not helpful for coping. Those of us that have a tendency to worry, you know, at times find that we experience worry as something that's uncontrollable, which means that in some cases we don't try and stop it. It can feel beyond us. Those of us that have a tendency to worry try to suppress worry thoughts using different coping strategies, which then strengthens and reinforces. So we hold on to it and we then end up internalizing that worry and kind of moving on. So if we can learn to manage or control worry rather than suppress it, if we can dig into it and address the emotion driving the thinking, we can construct ways in which we can strengthen our ability to respond by being more open with it. So that's what I wanted to say about worry. In the case of stress, stress is more about environmental demand. So when something feels beyond our ability to cope with it successfully. So stressful situations can cause both physiological manifestations in the body and psychological manifestations. So that's mind and emotion reactions. So no matter how strongly our body responds to stress, our emotional reaction is more tied to our thinking. So whether we can cope with the situation or not, it means that emotions respond to thinking. So as I said, you know, feeling stressed is very much about too many tasks all at once. So it is about scaling things back in some situations. As we know, daily stress can take its toll. Chronic exposure to daily stress can be detrimental to long-term health in all sorts of ways, and that might feel familiar to people. So what I've learned about stress is, as I say, it is about how we evaluate our environment. So, for example, in my office, sometimes when I'm talking to clients about stress, I might say to them, look, in this 50 minutes that we've got together, you know, I want you to write, I don't know, 100 words about why you feel stressed, count all the buttons in my bowl, water my plants, clean up my messy desk. Stress, too many tasks in one go that we can kind of cope with at any one time. In terms of overwhelmed, a feeling of overwhelmed may be experienced as an extreme level of stress, an emotional and a cognitive intensity to the point of feeling unable to function. And being overwhelmed can lead to being completely overcome or overpowered by thoughts and feelings. So in the case of both feeling overwhelmed and stressed, there is a perception by the self of how we are coping with our current situation, which may be accompanied by, I don't know, that kind of all too common feeling that life is unfolding faster than we can cope with, or our nervous system can cope with. And that can then lead to anxiety. So anxiety can feel like an escalating loss of control, and I don't know whether that sounds familiar to service users. So it can create this worst case scenario thinking and imagery, so that kind of what if sensation. And when faced with total uncertainty, it can be felt in the body. So it's not a neat and tidy thing, anxiety either. It's not an emotion that we can kind of, I don't know, easily put in a box. You might experience it as having no pattern at all, though there might be some obvious triggers. You don't always know when it's going to come and bite you. So it can be felt in the body, or you might start to notice it was a kind of an intense feeling. And that might be related to a thought, but there might be nothing particularly, or it might be related to a pattern, but there might not be anything particularly in your environment that you think that's the trigger for me. So the body sensations are very much that kind of fight, flight, freeze, collapse response that I could talk more about perhaps in another session. So, so I guess the first rule of anxiety management is to do something about it before it happens. And I don't want to be flippant about that. And I'm not suggesting, you know, that's easier said than done, but recognizing and understanding reactions to your environment and developing techniques for working through feelings of anxiety is perhaps the first rule of anxiety management. So an intolerance to uncertainty is definitely a contributing factor to all types of anxiety. And again, that is very much the what if. So it is about noticing, how am I experiencing, what's going on around me, and what I'm thinking. So it might be surprising to hear that, you know, anxiety can lead to certain ways of coping. And some of those are about worry. So some people use worry to cope with their anxiety, and sometimes we use avoidance to cope with our anxiety, neither of which are particularly effective. So, you know, one of the things about worry as a coping strategy is that is the thinking part of anxiety. So it's not a surprise perhaps to hear that worry and anxiety, you know, are very closely interlinked, but are different. But worry can be the start of the anxiety, and it is the thinking part of anxiety. And it can be that as I say, the beginning part where there is this chain of negative thoughts about bad things that might not happen in the future. And then we kind of, you know, enter overthinking. And then that kind of spiral that can kind of lead us to this kind of feeling of overwhelmedness. Again, avoidance is something that I mentioned as a coping strategy for anxiety, also not helpful. It can be harmful to ourselves. It can impact on our relationships. It can mean that your anxiety can escalate. There can be feelings of isolation and disconnection, and this in itself, on a primal level, so on an evolutionary level, can be felt as life-threatening. And when our felt sense is it's life and death on a primal level, on a body level, we can end up shutting down, collapsing. So that's your physiological response to what is happening in the nervous system, which is sometimes when people move from anxiety into panic and perhaps then in some cases pass out. So that's the collapse. So when we spend all of our energy kind of zigzagging around and away from what feels like it's consuming us, we're using valuable energy in suppressing things that we're avoiding. I hope that makes sense. So, okay, what happens when we feel overwhelmed? Okay, well, what helps when we feel overwhelmed? What helps when we feel overwhelmed? Easier said than done. My suggestion, for one, would be some guilt-free non-doing. So creating time for yourself, no agenda, which obviously makes perfect sense, but again, is easier said than done. What I'm suggesting is you give yourself permission to slow down. Again, easier said than done. That could start from a place of compassion with some internal dialogue, because non-doing offers space and time to process emotional information. So this isn't something that can happen when we are overwhelmed or very worried or very anxious. So if you're able to slow things down with your non-doing, that does give you the opportunity to explore perhaps better, what is it that I am feeling and why? If we pay attention to ourselves, when we begin to notice those intense emotions and feelings of being overwhelmed and slow everything down, we can maybe there's an opportunity then to get some clarity over what's actually happening and what the emotion is. Am I worried? Am I overwhelmed? Am I stressed? Am I anxious? So I would start with compassion. So take some time to walk alongside yourself in your discomfort. So how do we minimize anxiety triggers? So one of the things that I offer to clients is work around boundaries. So we've spoken about compassion. Okay, how else do we minimize anxiety? Set boundaries. So anxiety can be triggered sometimes by unrealistic expectations and an inability to say no, and that can sometimes lead to burnout. Not being able to say no, or perhaps saying yes, that's fine, I'll do that all of the time, is a boundary issue, and it can take place when we compromise ourselves. So when we're compromising ourselves, what we're doing is taking on potentially taking on too much. When we take on too much, we can end up feeling overwhelmed, worried, stressed, and that can lead to that anxiety trigger. So setting boundaries is really important. Unrealistic expectations, generally speaking, are about what's happening externally, but then can be internalized. So it's becomes how we see ourselves. You know, this is who I am. This is what I have to achieve. And that's very often conceived based on what's been learned, perhaps, or what conditions have been imposed by other people along the way, and becomes, as I say, you know, how we see ourselves. So I wanted to, because this is what was perhaps asked for from the last session, was some sort of tips and tricks as a way to build your capacity to create calm. And one of the things that I do with clients, it's a very, very simple thing, is what we call square breathing, which might be familiar to people. And that is very much about breathing in for 4 seconds, holding it for 4 seconds, and then breathing out for 4 seconds. These exercises are, as I say, designed to build your capacity to create calm, relaxation. And like any skill, they require practice. So, you know, if your inner critic is, you know, communicating something to you like, oh, you can't do it, like, you know, is there a way to reframe that conversation or that dialogue that you have with yourself, so that when you find it hard, you should offer yourself some compassion, okay, rather than this is too difficult for me, or I'm finding this hard, or give up because I'm no good at this, so I'm not going to bother. Square breathing, or I think they call it combat breathing, I think, in the military, but it is a way to communicate to yourself that you are safe. So when you notice that something is changing in your body, it is about regulating your breathing, which is going to calm down your nervous system, and that will communicate something different to what's going on in your mind. So we can't think straight, we can't make those decisions when our nervous system is kind of in a state of kind of dysregulation. So there is square breathing. So square breathing is about, as I say, it is breathing in for 4 seconds, holding it 2, 3, 4, breathing out for 4 seconds, and doing that on repeat. And that will help. And you could try that whenever you notice something happening inside your body that needs to be responded to. So that could be an increased heart rate, that could be a restlessness, that could be something that's going on inside your head that's communicating something in your body which you may not notice. The other thing that I offer to clients is this exercise which is around yogic breathing, and I know that you have a practitioner that does perhaps something similar. So this is about breathing from your belly. So it's very much about completely relaxing your belly and breathing in and out in the same way that you would do with your square breathing from your belly. So this is about getting comfy, resting your hand on your belly, breathing in deeply through the nose, feeling your belly expand outwards, and then breathing out through your mouth as your belly relaxes. And one thing that can help us, I suppose, to kind of know what's the pace of this is to blow as if you're perhaps not as a child blowing candles out on a cake, but blowing them out slowly. So if you were to imagine blowing out some candles on a cake, just really slowly, like that, that is going to slow things down for you. One of the other things that I do with clients is to invite them to befriend themselves. So I talked earlier about compassion. When we are talking to ourselves in a negative way, we are going to make judgments about ourselves. We're going to stay stuck there. So if you notice that you are having a dialogue with yourself, like, so because, you know, I don't know, people say things to like, oh, you know, I'm such an idiot, or I should have done this, or, you know, I need to kind of get a grip of myself. Or if you find yourself saying some of those things, you know, pull yourself together, you know, for God's sake, that kind of thing, you know, is there a way to reframe that and befriend yourself? So we've spoken about compassion. Sometimes when I start dialogue with clients, I might say, do you have any young children around you? Do you have any children yourself? You know, what is it that you would say to a child who appeared stressed, overwhelmed, scared? Probably reassure them, tell them it'll be okay. Give them, I don't know, information that makes them feel safe. When I say befriend yourself, if that feels like a difficult thing to do, what I encourage clients to do is talk to themselves as if they were talking to themselves as a child or to a child, sensitively, compassionately, you know, to create something safer and calmer. Rather than harsh or critical, you know, which, as I say, can leave you feeling stuck in that situation. So none of us arrived into this world feeling judged. You know, none of us arrived into this world, you know, having criticisms labelled upon us, you know, or judgments labelled upon us. You know, this is an opportunity for you perhaps to talk to yourself in the way that you would talk to yourself as a child, or to talk to yourself, or to talk to a child, you know, to create safety for them. So befriend yourself, offer yourself some compassion. One of the other things that I remind clients of is that feelings are not rooted in fact. So in the moment, when you're regulating yourself, it is about reminding you, what are the facts here? So sometimes it's about taking what's out of here, putting it down onto paper and going, what are the facts here? What is actually happening? What is the reality? And sometimes, you know, journaling is an opportunity for people to kind of empty out some of their things that are making them feel overwhelmed. So journaling is an opportunity to take out what's going on inside and put it down on paper and make more meaning of it. So that is about, you know, what are the facts here? You know, what's the reality versus, you know, what am I feeling? The other thing that can be quite useful to do is to rate your anxiety. So it's a kind of a hyper quick way to look at, where am I at right now? Where am I at right now? What is going on right now? What level is my anxiety on? Is it on 1? Is it on 10? The thing about anxiety is it will pass. So if you can rate it and then set yourself a timer, whether you've got, I don't know, on your, look at the clock, wherever, look at, if you can find a timer, what is going on now? Can I introduce something to level myself out and then remind myself that this will pass? because the thing about all emotions, including anxiety, is it will pass. Reminding yourself that things will pass, okay? And then rating it again to see where you're at. So you might be at a kind of a 10 when your anxiety starts, giving yourself a minute or 2 minutes, and then getting a sense of where you are then and there after that. Doing that on repeat is a reminder to yourself, this will pass. I hope that was helpful. I wanted to, I guess, give people an overview about, generally about emotions, then talk about anxiety and some of the things that happen in anxiety, and then give you some exercises to do to help you manage